sang Wanita Tangguh Datang Membawa Anak doesn't begin like a story. It begins like a bruise you don't remember earning, tender under the skin, flaring when the light hits it a certain way. On Cinemad Review, we talk about cinema as an emotional architecture, the way a film can build rooms inside you and then quietly lock the door. And this 2026 series, because it moves with the patience and repetition of life rather than the clean sprint of a movie, constructs its first room out of absence. Not dramatic absence. Not operatic loss. A subtler thing, the kind of absence that has become furniture. The kind you stop noticing until a child's voice says one impossible word, and the whole house starts to shake. There's a certain cruelty in time skips. They tell you, without apology, that the most important years happened off screen. That you don't get to witness the nights where someone learned how to sleep while missing a body. That you don't get to see the mornings where a woman rehearsed strength until it sounded like her own voice. 6 years pass in a sentence here, but the series doesn't treat those 6 years as empty. It treats them as pressure, as invisible weather. When Qiu re-enters the world of CEO Jiang Nanyan, he doesn't arrive like a savior or a long-lost lover returning to complete an unfinished romance. He arrives like a man stepping back into a dream he once woke up from, hoping the air is still breathable. The opening images are almost deceptively clean. The camera doesn't chase sensation. It prefers distance. We observe spaces before we observe people. A corporate lobby that feels like a cathedral built for money, glass walls that reflect faces into duplicates, polished floors that hold light the way a lake holds the sky. The palette leans into cool, controlled tones, silvers, pale blues, sterile whites, like the world has been bleached of impulsive emotion. And in this world, Jiang Nanyan appears as a shape first, a silhouette framed against windows, city behind her like a digital painting of ambition. The direction makes a choice immediately. She is not introduced with warmth. She is introduced with containment. Watch how she moves. Not in the obvious way. Not in the strong woman cliché where strength is a pose. Her strength is a practiced economy. She doesn't waste gestures. She doesn't give her breath away for free. She turns her head like she's turning a page, each motion deliberate, trimmed of softness. She isn't cold. She is armored. And what makes this series quietly devastating is that it never mocks that armor, never punishes her for it, never asks the audience to fix her. It simply shows you the cost. The cost is in her shoulders, how they never fully fall, how the body forgets what peace feels like. The cost is in how her eyes scan rooms, not for wonder, but for threats disguised as smiles. Then the child appears, and the frame changes, not dramatically. Not with swelling music or slow motion. The series understands that life's biggest emotional detonations often arrive like ordinary seconds. A child steps into the shot the way a thought steps into your mind. Sudden, uninvited, impossible to ignore. The boy's presence shifts the color temperature subtly warmer, not because the world becomes safe, but because the series wants you to feel the dangerous sweetness of him. He is light. And light reveals things people were hoping to keep hidden. He sees the necklace, and the way the camera looks at that necklace is not the way a show looks at a clue. It's not a plot device, it's a relic. The lens lingers with a reverence that borders on grief. Metal catching a sliver of illumination. A small object with too much history inside it. The chain rests against skin like a memory that never found its proper ending. The necklace is filmed as if it has weight beyond physics, as if it can pull the past into the present with one small swing. The boy's gaze locks onto it with that terrifying purity children have, the purity of not understanding how much they are about to destroy just by telling the truth. And then he says it. Not loudly, not for attention, with a simple certainty of recognition. Aya. Father. In that moment, sang Wanita Tangguh Datang Membawa Anak becomes a different kind of story. Not because the premise changes, but because the emotional gravity shifts. The series stops being about a reunion and starts being about an eruption. about how a single word can collapse 6 years of careful distance into one unbearable closeness. Chu's face in that beat is a masterclass in restrained shock. The acting here isn't built on grand reactions. It's built on microfailures. A blink that arrives half a second too late. The corner of a mouth that wants to speak but doesn't know what language to use. His eyes widen, but not in disbelief, more like a man whose internal map has suddenly been redrawn while he was walking. He doesn't look heroic. He looks exposed, like someone just touched a scar he forgot existed. And then Jiang Nanyan, because she is the real weather system of the series, does something that breaks you if you're paying attention. She doesn't panic. She doesn't theatrically deny. She doesn't rush to explain. She freezes in a way that feels practiced, as if she has imagined this exact moment 1,000 times in the private cinema of her mind. But imagining a moment and living it are two different kinds of pain. Her eyes flicker toward her son, then toward Chu, then away. Because to look too long would be to confess something she has survived by refusing to name. The show understands silence not as emptiness, but as dialogue. In the space after the boy says, "Aya," there is a hush so thick you can feel it pressing against the character's throats. The sound design doesn't rush to comfort you. The room tone becomes suddenly audible. A distant hum of air conditioning, the faint echo of footsteps somewhere beyond the frame, the subtle rattle of a keychain in a pocket. Normal sounds become cruel because they continue while life changes. That's what trauma feels like. The world refusing to pause for your devastation. And the score, if we can even call it a score in these early moments, doesn't swell into sentiment. It trembles at the edges. A low note that barely registers as music. Like the soundtrack is holding its breath too, uncertain whether to mourn or to warn. From here, the series moves like a slow tightening. It doesn't sprint into revelations. It drifts into them the way fog drifts through a city street, reshaping everything without being noticed until it's too late. Chu doesn't demand answers immediately, and that choice, so rare in melodrama, makes the tension more unbearable. He watches. He listens. He tries to place this child's face into his own history like a puzzle piece that shouldn't exist. The writing gives him a human intelligence, the kind that understands when to speak and when to let silence betray the truth. And Jiang Nanyan, in response, becomes even more precise. She answers questions with the careful half-truths of someone who has learned that honesty can be weaponized. You can feel her measuring every word before it leaves her mouth, not because she's deceptive by nature, but because she's protecting something fragile. Not just her son. Herself. The version of herself that survived those missing 6 years. This is where the series' psychological portrait begins to depend. On the surface, it is about fate, reunion, a child bridging to adults who have become strangers. But underneath, it is about control, who gets to define the past, who gets to narrate what happened, who gets to decide what a relationship was. Jiang Nanyan has built a life where she is the author. A CEO's world is a world of authored realities. Meetings scheduled, outcomes anticipated, narratives managed. And now, in one sentence from a child, the past writes itself back into her present without permission. Chu, meanwhile, represents the opposite energy. Someone whose life seems shaped by what happened to him rather than what he planned. The way he carries himself, slightly guarded, slightly worn, suggests a man who has known helplessness. When he saved her 6 years ago, it wasn't just a heroic act. It was a collision. A moment where two lives touched in crisis, left fingerprints on each other, and then separated before the fingerprints could fade. The show keeps returning to the necklace because it's the perfect symbol for this kind of connection. A necklace sits close to the pulse. It moves with your breath. It is both decoration and tether. In many cultures, necklaces are gifts of intimacy, tokens of protection, or marks of belonging. Here, it becomes a quiet argument. If the necklace is the same, what else is the same? If the necklace survived the years, what feelings did too? If a child recognizes it, what has been spoken in that child's home? What stories, What names, what half-remembered myths? Cinematographically, sang Wanita Tangguh Datang Membawa Anak is obsessed with reflections and barriers. Glass between people. Doorways framing bodies like portraits of loneliness. Windows that turn characters into faint overlays on cityscapes. Jia Nanyan is often shot through transparent surfaces, as if she is always slightly unreachable, always behind something. Qi Xu, on the other hand, is framed in more tactile spaces, concrete, wood, fabric, textures you can almost feel. The visual language becomes a conversation. She is the world of polished distance, he is the world of lived-in edges. When they share a frame, the shot composition frequently places an object between them. A chair, a table, a file folder, even the child himself, love as both bridge and barricade. And that child. The series refuses to make him a mere cute device. His performance, because child actors can often be used as emotional shortcuts, is guided with surprising restraint. The boy isn't constantly smiling to melt hearts. He isn't constantly crying to manipulate you. He is simply present, curious, direct, sometimes unknowingly cruel, as children can be, because they don't understand the choreography adults perform to keep their pain hidden. He asks questions the way children do, not to interrogate, but to locate himself in the world. Who are you? Why do you look like that? Why does mom's hand tighten when you enter the room? Why does the air feel different? There's a moment early on, so small you could miss it if you're watching casually, where Jia Nanyan's hand hovers over her son's shoulder when Qi Xu draws near. She doesn't grab him. She doesn't pull him away. Her fingers simply hover, not touching, like a protective instinct that doesn't want to reveal itself. That's the kind of detail this series lives on, the almost touch, the almost confession. The body betraying what the mouth refuses to say. And then we start to feel the show's real rhythm. It's not about events. It's about proximity. How close can two people stand to each other before their histories start bleeding through their expressions? How long can someone keep their voice steady when a name from the past is spoken in the present? The series makes you sit in those spaces. It doesn't cut away too quickly. It lets discomfort bloom. It lets longing appear, then gets strangled back down into politeness. The dialogue is written with the precision of people who have learned to survive by speaking around the truth. Jia Nanyan's sentences often end a fraction too early, as if she's cutting off the part that would make her vulnerable. Qi Xu's lines often begin with a kind of hesitation, like he's checking the emotional temperature before stepping into the room. When they speak to each other, it feels like two languages trying to share a single mouth. And because she is a CEO, the world around Jia Nanyan is full of performance. Smiles that are rehearsed. Compliments that are strategically placed. Meetings that are rituals of dominance disguised as teamwork. The show uses those corporate spaces not merely as background, but as metaphor. Jia Nanyan has built her life inside systems where emotion is liability. And then a child calls someone father, and suddenly emotion becomes unavoidable, a hostile takeover of the heart. Qi Xu's reappearance in her life is not staged as romantic destiny, even though the premise invites it. It's staged as intrusion. Not malicious intrusion, more like fate is a burglar that doesn't steal objects, it steals control. And that's where the series becomes quietly philosophical. How much of our life is authored, and how much is simply what returns when we thought it was gone? How many finished stories are only paused narratives waiting for the right trigger to resume? That necklace is that trigger. A physical object acting as an emotional key. It unlocks not only memory, but identity. Because if Qi Xu is Aya, then who has Jia Nanyan been for 6 years? Not just a mother. A curator of truth. A gatekeeper of origin. And if she has kept this from him, whether out of fear, necessity, pride, or protection, then the show invites a moral ambiguity that it refuses to simplify. It doesn't ask you to condemn her immediately. It asks you to understand what kind of world would make a woman believe secrecy is safety. The flashbacks, when they begin to arrive, are not presented like exposition dumps. They arrive like intrusive thoughts. Fragments. Textures. A dim corridor. Rain on pavement. The muffled chaos of that night 6 years ago when Kyuaikshu saved her. The past is shot with warmer shadows, not bright nostalgia, but the umber of memory that has been handled too much. The camera in these moments is slightly less stable, as if even the lens can't hold the past still. The sound becomes more intimate, breaths louder, heartbeats almost implied, the world closer to the skin. And that's the psychological brilliance of it. Trauma doesn't come back as a clean story. It comes back as sensations. The show respects that. It lets memory be incomplete, haunted by what isn't shown. The audience is not given the comfort of total information. We are given the discomfort of partial truth, which is the only truth most people ever have. There's a particular shot that encapsulates the series' emotional language early on. Kyuaikshu stands in a hallway outside an office, fluorescent lighting flattening the world into a pale hum. The glass door reveals Jiang Nanyan inside, speaking to someone, her mouth moving but the sound muted. The child stands beside Kyuaikshu, looking up at him with trust that hasn't been earned on screen but feels eerily inevitable. And Kyuaikshu's reflection overlays Jiang Nanyan's figure in the glass, two bodies occupying the same space without touching. It's a visual poem about connection without contact. About how life can put you inches from someone you once mattered to, and still make you feel like a ghost. Dash 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 dash. In that shot, the series tells you what it's really about. Not romance, not revenge, not corporate intrigue. It's about the terror of being seen. Kyuaikshu is being seen by a child who believes in him. Jiang Nanyan is being seen by a past she tried to outgrow. And the audience is being asked to witness not just what happens next, but what it means when two people are forced to re-encounter the version of themselves they buried to survive. The writing never allows Kyuaikshu to become a simple victim or a simple hero. His pain is real, yes, but it doesn't automatically grant him moral superiority. There are hints, quiet, placed like shadows at the edge of scenes, that he, too, is running from something. That his life in the 6-year gap wasn't a blank page but a difficult chapter. The show doesn't announce this. It suggests it through his posture when money is mentioned, through the way he flinches at certain tones of authority, through the way he watches security guards as if he's learned what it means to be treated like a suspect. And then there's Jiang Nanyan's loneliness, which the series paints without melodrama. Loneliness here is not crying in the rain. It's eating alone in a brightly lit kitchen while a child talks about his day. It's pausing before answering his questions. It's turning off a bedside lamp and staring into darkness for a second longer than necessary. The show understands that loneliness for a strong woman is rarely performed outwardly. It is lived privately, in tiny pauses, in the way your breath catches when you think you're finally safe to feel something. One of the most affecting choices is how the series uses space in domestic scenes. Jiang Nanyan's home is not cozy in the conventional sense. It's beautiful, yes, but arranged with the same discipline as her office. Furniture feels curated. Lines are clean. Decorations are minimal. It's a home that looks like it was designed to impress, not necessarily to exhale. And within that controlled space, the child's toys appear like little rebellions, bright colors on neutral surfaces, plastic noisemakers in a world of quiet elegance. Motherhood has invaded her aesthetic the way truth has invaded her narrative. Messily, honestly, without permission. When Kyuaikshu steps into that home for the first time, the scene is shot like a trespass into a museum. Shoes on polished floor. His gaze moving across objects, reading a life. The camera follows him slowly, not to create suspense like a thriller, but to let us feel the discomfort of entering someone else's carefully maintained reality. And Jiang Nanyan watches him watch. That's the key. She isn't just guarding her son. She's guarding her story. Their conversations, especially in these early stretches, are battles fought with politeness. The series makes you feel how exhausting that is, how much energy it takes to keep your voice calm while your heart is trying to claw its way out of your chest. The acting sells this through restraint. When Jiang Nanyan lies, or avoids, the lie is not performed with villainous confidence. It's performed with minimalism, as if lying has become a tool she hates but knows how to use. Qi Qiu doesn't call her out immediately, and that choice reads not as weakness but as an emotional strategy. He is gathering evidence, yes, but he is also trying not to break something irreparably. Because the show makes clear, without spelling it out, that once certain truths are spoken aloud, you can never return to the previous version of your relationship. Silence becomes a fragile truce. The series also understands that fate is not inherently romantic. Fate can be violent. Fate can be invasive. Fate can drag you back into rooms you barely survived. When the boy calls Qi Qiu Aya, it could have been a moment designed purely for audience squeals, a hook for sentimental obsession. But the directing refuses that easy sugar. The moment lands like a dropped glass. Sharp, irreversible, echoing. And echoing is the word. The series is full of echoes. Visual echoes. The necklace appearing again and again, sometimes prominent, sometimes barely visible. Emotional echoes. Jiang Nanyan's guardedness mirrored in Qi Qiu's cautiousness. Narrative echoes. The idea of saving someone, and what saving really costs. Sound echoes too. Footsteps in long corridors, the repeated chime of elevator doors, the soft click of a necklace clasp, tiny sounds that return like recurring thoughts. There's a philosophical question that starts haunting the series almost immediately. What does a person owe to the truth if the truth might destroy the life they built to survive? The show doesn't answer. It circles the question like a predator and like a prayer. Jiang Nanyan's strength, we begin to realize, may not be the strength of domination. It may be the strength of endurance. But endurance, when stretched too far, becomes numbness. And numbness can look like cruelty from the outside. Qi Qiu's presence threatens to resensitize her, to make her feel again. And that, for someone who has survived by turning feeling into a locked drawer, is terrifying. You can see it in her micro-expressions when he speaks gently to the child, in the way her eyes soften for a fraction of a second and then harden, as if she caught herself almost being human. The child, meanwhile, becomes the show's most brutal force, not because he intends harm, but because innocence is incapable of strategic silence. He doesn't know how to protect adults from themselves. He doesn't know how to keep secrets that were never his. He simply wants coherence. He wants a world where the necklace means something, where the word father has a face, where love is allowed to be named. And that desire for coherence is what threatens the adult world, because adults often survive by living with incoherence. As the early episodes settle into their mood, you start to feel the series' confidence in stillness. It lingers on hands, on the way Qi Qiu's fingers twitch when the boy reaches for him, on the way Jiang Nanyan's hand tightens around a cup, knuckles whitening as she listens from a distance. It frames faces in close-up without flattering them, allowing pores, faint lines, the rawness of real skin under harsh light. It uses long takes not to show off technical prowess, but to force you to inhabit discomfort without escape. And then, when the show does cut, the cuts have meaning. It will cut away from a near confession to an empty hallway. It will cut from a heated glance to a city skyline that looks indifferent. It will cut from the child's laughter to Jiang Nanyan alone in an elevator, her smile gone as soon as the doors close, like she left it outside with the world. These edits become emotional punctuation marks, reminding us that performance and private truth are separated by thin, sliding doors. By the time Qi Qiu and Jiang Nanyan share a longer conversation, one where the topic approaches the child without explicitly naming him, the series has already built a pressure cooker. The room feels too small. The air feels too clean. The camera positions them at opposite ends of the frame, leaving negative space between them like an unspoken confession. And the necklace is there, quiet, gleaming occasionally when she shifts, like a heartbeat made visible. Qi Qiu's voice in this scene is carefully controlled, but it carries something else underneath. Not anger, not accusation, but a kind of mourning for a life he didn't get to. dash 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 live. He isn't just confronting a secret. He is brushing against the idea that there might be a son he never held as a newborn, never watched take first steps, never soothed through fevered nights. The show lets that grief appear without turning it into melodrama. It appears as a swallow, as a pause, as a moment where he looks at the child of screen and his eyes briefly lose focus, like he's seeing 6 years he can never reclaim. And Jiang Nanyan's response is not a villain's denial. It's a fortress speaking. Her words are calm, but her breathing changes, slightly faster, slightly shallower. The performance is precise enough that you can almost feel her heartbeat accelerating. The series places us close enough to her face to catch the smallest tremor in her lower eyelid, that involuntary quiver that betrays how hard she is working to remain intact. This is the emotional engine of Sang Wanita Tangguh Datang Membawa Anak. Two adults negotiating the border between truth and survival, while a child stands in the middle holding a word like a match. And every time that match flares, the show asks, what burns first? The lies? The armor? The love? Or the people themselves? The atmosphere never lets you relax. Even in tender moments, there is an undercurrent of dread, not the dread of danger, but the dread of inevitability. You can feel, in the show's pacing, that the truth is not a question of if. It's a question of how and when, and what will it destroy on its way out. There's a scene near the end of this early stretch where Jiang Nanyan watches her son sleeping. The lighting is low, umber, the kind of bedside glow that makes the world look softer than it is. The camera stays behind her shoulder, not fully revealing her face, as if even the audience doesn't have permission to see what she's feeling. The child's breathing is gentle, rhythmic. The room is quiet except for that breath and the faint, distant sound of traffic outside, life continuing in the dark. Jiang Nanyan reaches out, slowly, and adjusts the blanket. Her fingertips brush the fabric with a tenderness that contradicts her public persona, and for a moment, her hand lingers, hovering above his chest, as if she's checking that he is real, that this life she built is still here. Then she withdraws her hand, too quickly, and the necklace slips forward slightly, catching the light. The camera isolates that glint, and in the silence, you can almost hear the past moving closer, like footsteps in a hallway that never ends, approaching the door she's been holding shut for 6 years, while somewhere in the other room, unseen, Qiu stands awake with a question he's afraid to ask, because the moment he asks it, nothing in any of their lives will ever return to the shape it had before. The necklace keeps catching light, like it's trying to speak. In the episodes that follow, the series begins to weaponize time itself. Not through frantic editing or countdown clocks, but through the slow, relentless pressure of inevitability. The camera starts to hold on objects longer. A half-empty coffee cup cooling on a marble counter, a child's abandoned toy truck parked crookedly on the floor, the faint smudge of fingerprints on a glass door. These are not just set dressing. They are evidence. Evidence of life continuing while people inside it are suspended, waiting for the next detonation. Jiang Nanyan's days begin to fracture in ways only the audience can see. She still commands boardrooms with the precision of a surgeon, her voice never wavering, her gaze slicing through hesitation. But the camera now lingers on the aftermath. The way her hand trembles for half a second when she reaches for a pen, the way she exhales once the door closes behind her, as if she's been holding her breath since morning. The show never underlines these moments with music. It trusts the silence to do the work. And silence, in this series, is never empty. It's crowded with everything unsaid. Qiu, meanwhile, begins to haunt her world like a ghost who hasn't decided whether to haunt or to heal. He doesn't force confrontation. He simply exists in proximity. Waiting rooms, parking garages, the lobby of her building where security now recognizes him and waves him through without asking. Each time he appears, the frame tightens slightly, as if the world is shrinking around them. The cinematography begins to favor shallow depth of field. Jiang Nanyan sharp in focus, everything behind her blurred, as if her reality is narrowing to the single point of him. The color palette, once cool and corporate, starts to warm in his presence, subtle shifts in lighting, a touch more umber in the shadows, like his body carries heat she's been denying herself. There's a scene where they are forced into the same elevator. Just the two of them. The child is not there to act as buffer. The doors close, and the show does something cruel. It lets the elevator ride in real time. No cuts. No music. Just the soft mechanical hum, the faint sway of the car, the numbers climbing slowly. Jian Nanyan stands facing forward, hands clasped in front of her like she's in a lineup. Kuai Kshu stands slightly behind and to the side, not crowding her, but close enough that she can feel his presence in her peripheral vision. The camera is positioned between them, catching both profiles in a single frame, their reflections overlapping in the polished metal wall. He doesn't speak at first. Then, quietly, almost to himself, "He has your eyes." It's not an accusation. It's an observation. But it lands like a hand around her throat. Jian Nanyan's reflection in the metal wall flickers slightly as the elevator passes a floor. Her jaw tightens. Not dramatically. Just enough. The kind of tightening that happens when someone is trying not to cry in public. She doesn't respond. She doesn't need to. The silence between them is so dense it feels like a third person in the elevator. When the doors finally open, she steps out first, brisk, controlled. But the camera stays on Kuai Kshu for a beat longer. He doesn't follow immediately. He stands there, watching her walk away, and for the first time, we see something break across his face. Not anger, not triumph, but a kind of exhausted wonder. Like a man who just realized the war he thought was over has only been on pause. The series begins to explore memory not as flashback, but as physical sensation. When Kuai Kshu touches the necklace, later, in a moment of quiet confrontation, the contact is filmed in extreme close-up. Skin against metal. The chain shifting slightly against Jian Nanyan's collarbone. The sound design isolates the faint rasp of metal on skin, makes it intimate, almost obscene. It's not erotic. It's archaeological. He's touching history. She's letting him, barely. Her breathing changes, becomes shallow, audible. The camera doesn't show her face fully. It shows her throat moving as she swallows. The necklace becomes a conduit, past flowing into present through the smallest point of contact. And then she steps back. Not far. Just enough. The distance of a single breath. But it's enough to sever the moment. The show understands that intimacy, once interrupted, doesn't resume easily. It leaves residue. It leaves damage. The child, meanwhile, becomes more dangerous in his innocence. He starts asking questions that children ask when they sense something is being hidden. Why don't you like Uncle Kuai? Why does he look sad when he looks at you? Why do you hold my hand tighter when he's near? The series films these questions in bright, ordinary light, kitchen mornings, playground afternoons, making them feel even more brutal because they happen in the middle of normal life. There's a scene where the boy draws a picture, 3 stick figures holding hands. One tall, one medium, one small. He labels them carefully. Mama, Aya, Aku. He shows it to Jian Nanyan with pride. The camera watches her face as she looks at it. Not a collapse. Not tears. Just a stillness so complete it feels like the air has been sucked out of the room. She smiles, thin, practiced, and says, "That's beautiful, Sayang." But her hand, when she takes the drawing, trembles so slightly only the lens catches it. Kuai Kshu sees the drawing later, not because she shows him, because the child does. The moment is filmed from a distance, through a doorway, like we're intruding on something sacred and terrible. Kuai Kshu takes the paper with both hands, as if it's fragile. His thumb brushes over the crayon lines. The camera moves in slowly, not to his face, but to his hands, how they hold the drawing like it's the first real proof he's been given. When he finally looks up, his eyes are wet, but he doesn't cry. He just nods, once, like he's accepting a verdict. The series begins to use weather as emotional architecture. Rain becomes a recurring presence, not dramatic storms, but the soft, persistent rain of a city that doesn't care about human heartbreak. Characters stand under awnings, water dripping from umbrellas, faces half-lit by neon. There's a scene where Jiang Nanyan waits for her driver, rain misting around her, and Qiu appears beside her, sharing the small dry space without asking. They don't speak. They just stand there, inches apart, watching rain blur the world. The sound of water on concrete becomes almost meditative. And in that silence, something shifts. Not reconciliation. Not yet. Just recognition. To people acknowledging that they are both getting wet in the same storm. The corporate world begins to close in. Not through cartoonish villains, but through the quieter violence of systems. Board members who question Jiang Nanyan's focus. Whispers about her personal distractions. A rival who senses weakness and circles. The show uses these plot mechanics not for excitement, but to show how strength, when it becomes a performance, can be weaponized against the performer. Jiang Nanyan's power is real, but it's also a cage. The higher she climbs, the less room she has to fall apart. And falling apart, the series suggests, might be the only way to feel again. Qiu, in contrast, exists outside those systems. He's not poor. He has dignity, work, a life. But he's not part of the machine that demands emotional suppression as currency. His freedom terrifies her. Not because he's reckless, but because he can afford to feel. He can afford to ask. He can afford to stand in the rain and wait for an answer that might destroy him. There's a moment where he says, quietly, I never stopped wearing mine. He doesn't show the matching necklace, he doesn't need to. The implication hangs in the air like smoke. 6 years. He kept it. Not as a romantic gesture. As a question he never stopped asking. The camera doesn't cut to her reaction immediately. It stays on him, letting the weight of that confession settle. When it finally cuts to Jiang Nanyan, her face is unreadable, but her hand moves unconsciously to her own necklace, fingers closing around it like she's trying to silence it. The series begins to explore the idea of debt, not financial, but emotional. What do you owe someone who saved your life? What do you owe someone whose life you might have altered without their consent? What do you owe a child who deserves a truth you're not ready to give? The show doesn't moralize. It simply places these questions in rooms with people and lets them breathe. And then there's the night scene. The one that changes everything. It's late. The child is asleep. Jiang Nanyan's home is dark except for the city glow through windows. She's in the kitchen, barefoot, in silk pajamas that cost more than most people's rent, pouring herself a drink she doesn't want. The camera tracks her slowly, like it's afraid to startle her. Qiu is there. He let himself in, or was let in, the details don't matter. He stands in the doorway, backlit, a silhouette with weight. They don't speak at first. They just look. The kind of looking that happens when words have failed too many times. Then Jiang Nanyan says, very softly, you shouldn't be here. Not angry. Not commanding. Just stating a fact, like she's reminding herself. Qiu doesn't move closer. He stays in the doorway, respecting the boundary even as he crosses it emotionally. I know, he says. And then, quieter, but I am. The silence that follows is one of the longest in the series. The camera doesn't move. It just holds on them, to figures separated by a kitchen island, by 6 years, by choices neither of them fully understood at the time. The only sound is the faint tick of a clock somewhere, and the soft clink of ice in her glass as her hand begins to shake. She sets the glass down, carefully, like it's made of something more fragile than crystal. And then, finally, she asks the question she's been carrying like a wound. What do you want from me? It's not defensive. It's exhausted. It's the question of someone who has spent years preparing for every attack except sincerity. Qiu's answer is simple. Too simple. Dangerous in its simplicity. I want to know his name. Not our son. Not yet. Just his name. As if naming is the first step toward claiming, and he's asking permission to take that step. Jiang Nanyan's face changes. not dramatically. Just a flicker. A crack. The kind of crack that happens in marble when the pressure has been building too long. She looks away, toward the hallway where her son sleeps, and for the first time, her voice breaks, not with tears, but with the raw edge of truth finally cutting through armor. His name, she says, is the only thing I ever got to choose. The camera stays on her as the weight of that lands. Not just for Kyuaikshu. For her. The only thing she ever got to choose. In a life where everything else, her survival, her success, her solitude, was shaped by forces outside her control, his name was her territory. Her creation. Her secret garden. And now even that is being asked for. The scene doesn't end with revelation. It ends with her walking past him, close enough that her shoulder brushes his arm, and disappearing down the hallway without another word. The camera lingers on Kyuaikshu in the empty kitchen, the city lights flickering across his face like static, while somewhere in the dark, a child breathes evenly in sleep, unaware that the world is tilting on its axis because two adults finally stood in the same room and admitted, without saying it, that none of them have been okay for 6 years. And the necklace, resting against her skin as she walks away, catches the light one last time, like it's saying, "This is only the beginning of what remembering will cost." Sang Wanita Tangguh Datang Membawa Anak is not a title that simply announces a story. It feels like a confession whispered through time, a sentence that already carries a wound, a promise, and a quiet storm. From the very first frame, it doesn't ask you to watch, it asks you to remember. To remember what it feels like to love someone you were never supposed to meet again. To remember what it means to carry a secret inside your own body. And as we drift into its world here on Cinenomad Review, it becomes clear that this is not just another romantic drama, not just another CEO fantasy, not just another tear-soaked reunion. It is a study of distance. Between past and present. Between duty and longing. Between a child's innocent certainty and two adults who have spent 6 years trying to convince themselves that what happened was a single night, a single accident, a single fate they could seal away and never reopen. The film opens the way some memories return, not with clarity, but with fragments. Streetlights running like streaks of wet paint across the windshield. The lonely hum of city traffic at an hour when even the neon seems tired. In the darkness of a near-empty road, the camera drifts through a slow tracking shot, almost floating, detached, as if we're already inside a recollection that nobody asked to revisit. The rain is not violent, not cinematic in a showy way. It's thin, persistent, more like the sky is exhaling a long, exhausted breath. We see him first, not as the untouchable CEO, not as the carefully curated public image, but as a man caught between consciousness and oblivion. Jiang Nanyan slumped in the back seat, his head tilted against the window, city lights reflected across his face like fleeting constellations. The driver's panicked shouts muffle into the soundscape, distorted by the rain, by the glass, by the faint ringing in his ears. In this moment, before the story even truly begins, the film plants the seed. This is a man who survives not because of his power, but because fate decides to be briefly merciful. And fate, in this film, has a name and a heartbeat. She appears not as a destined lover framed in soft focus, but as a tired woman with scraped palms and a stubborn spine, Kyuaikshu. The camera finds her not in slow-motion glamour, but in a cramped little apartment, fluorescent light bruising the air, the sound of a kettle boiling in the background. There is a weight to the way she moves, a fatigue layered over deliberate motion, like someone who has been taught to brace for impact in every small task. When she later steps into the rain and sees the car that has swerved too sharply, the door flung open, the body half-collapsed, there is no orchestral swell, no instant romantic cue. Instead, the sound design pulls back. We hear her footsteps in a shallow puddle, her breath catching, the low distant groan of the city. Her first reaction is not infatuation, it's survival instinct. She doesn't know who he is. She only knows that there's blood mixing with the rain, that a life is tipping toward the edge, and that somewhere deep inside her, something refuses to let that happen in front of her. The rescue itself is shot with a kind of restrained intimacy that already hints at the film's deeper obsession with touch, with proximity, with how the human body remembers contact even when the mind wants to forget. Hands are the main characters in this sequence. Kyu-Aik-shu's trembling fingers pressing against his neck, checking for a pulse. Her grip tightening on his shoulder as she tries to lift him with a strength she doesn't have but still forces out of herself. The driver's hands fumbling with the phone, with the door, with the GPS. Meanwhile, the camera lingers on the barely perceptible shift in Nanyan's expression. The slight twitch of an eyelid. A jaw that clenches, then relaxes. A breath that stutters, then deepens. He's not fully conscious, but he's not gone either. And in that narrow threshold between awareness and oblivion, his body learns something. It learns the sensation of being held by someone who expects nothing in return. There is a moment, so brief you might miss it, when the pendant around his neck swings forward as she pulls at his shirt to stabilize his breathing. The necklace catches the light from a passing car, a small gleam in the storm, and the frame tightens around it just long enough to register. Not long enough to explain. Just long enough to nestle somewhere in the viewer's subconscious. The film trusts that we will remember this, just as it trusts that the people in this story will pretend not to. When the hospital scene arrives, it doesn't explode in urgency. Instead, it decelerates. The pacing collapses into a controlled, suspended silence. White light diffuses over sterile corridors, the color palette cooling into smoked blues and pale grays. Nurses move in measured, unhurried patterns. The monitors beep softly. Doors hiss open and closed with a soft, pneumatic sigh. We don't see the frantic rush we expect from a life-or-death emergency. We see the aftermath of barely averted loss. It's as though the threat has already passed, and what remains is a more insidious kind of tension. What happens now that he's alive? Kyu-Aik-shu sits in the waiting room, soaking wet, hair clinging to her cheeks. The chair next to her is empty, as if the film is already reserving a permanent absence. She stares at her own hands, the same hands the camera honored minutes before, now stripped of purpose and stained with streaks of dried blood. The sound thins to an ambient echo, distant footsteps, a cough, the faint whir of air conditioning. Every so often, we cut to her gaze lifting toward the slightly ajar door that leads into his ward. She doesn't enter. She doesn't belong there. She knows it. The film knows it. The social architecture of this world would never willingly allow a woman like her to step fully into a room that contains a man like him. When she finally sees him again that night, still unconscious, framed in the soft, clinical glow of a single bedside lamp, the director chooses not to turn it into a melodramatic moment. We don't get a slow zoom into teary eyes or a sweeping track across his body. Instead, there's a quietly devastating stillness. The camera holds them both in a wide shot. He is lying on the bed, machines gently hunting for signs of life, his chest rising and falling rhythmically. She stands by the door, a small, hesitant silhouette, as if she might bolt at the slightest movement. Her face is not flooded with affection. It's flooded with a disoriented sense of responsibility. She saved him. That knowledge sits on her shoulders like an invisible weight. The script never has her say this out loud, but Beijing at midnight is crowded with unspoken things. In many dramas of this type, the night of fate is painted in broad strokes of fantasy, softened lights, convenient coincidences, orchestral flourishes. But here, the rhythm of that night is fractured, uncomfortable, morally murky. We aren't given a glossy, sanitized origin story. We are given a story about two people in states of vulnerability, one physically, one emotionally, colliding under circumstances too chaotic to fully grasp. The film is not interested in romanticizing what happens. It is interested in forcing us to sit with the aftermath. With the way memory blurs details we don't want to see, sharpens fragments we wish we could forget, and reshapes truth until we can live with it. The narrative does something very important. It does not cling to that night. It does not fetishize it. It does not stretch it into an extended, indulgent sequence. Instead, It fractures time. There is a cut. A rupture. The screen goes black for just a second longer than feels comfortable, and when the image returns, 6 years have passed. This temporal jump is less about surprise and more about intentional disorientation. The film wants us to feel the gap, to sense that there is an entire universe of pain, choice, and consequence that we will not be allowed to fully revisit. At least, not yet. When we return, the world is brighter, but the light feels thin, like it's struggling to reach the corners. We meet a small boy running down a narrow street, his sneakers slapping against the pavement with the unfiltered enthusiasm only a 6-year-old can have. The sound design here shifts dramatically. The echoing corridors and rainy roads are replaced by layered warmth. Street vendors calling out lazy greetings. The rattle of a bicycle wheel. The low chatter of neighbors. The camera follows the boy at his eye level, tracking him not as an accessory, but as a point-of-view character. His name will be revealed in time, but before he speaks, before he is framed as anyone's son, he is framed as himself, curious, alert, and carrying a gaze that is about to rewrite the lives of 2 adults. The film chooses to reveal Kyu of the present day through her son's eyes. We see her first not as a woman defined by sacrifice, but as his center of gravity. In the soft, handheld shot that introduces her, she is bent over a makeshift table in their modest home, packing lunch boxes with an efficiency that betrays routine. Her hair is tied back with a fading elastic band, a few stubborn strands refusing to be tamed. There is tiredness in the slope of her shoulders, yes, but there is also gumption, a kind of unyielding quietness that doesn't need to be explained. When her son darts into the frame and clings to her waist, she doesn't recoil from the contact. She absorbs it, like a shoreline absorbing a wave it has been waiting for all day. The palette around them is warm but worn. Browns, muted yellows, washed out reds. There is no sign of luxury, but there is no attempt to aestheticize poverty either. This is not hardship as a spectacle. This is survival as a rhythm. A ball on the shelf that's been glued back together. A pair of shoes by the door with frayed laces replaced by mismatched strings. The kind of details that tell you everything you need to know about how closely they live to the edge, without a single line of exposition. Kyu's relationship with her son is where the film's heart beats loudest, but even here, it refuses sentimentality. Their interactions are laced with small, almost invisible negotiations between truth and omission. When he asks where his father is, the scene is not structured around a huge revelation or an emotional collapse. Instead, we get something far more painful, practiced deflection. The tilt of her head. The tightening of her lips. The eyes that focus on the task in front of her just a bit too intensely. The film pays attention to that tension, the way love contorts in the presence of a lie told for protection. The child's performance is crucial, and the direction leans heavily into naturalism. He doesn't act like a scripted kid reciting lines designed to melt the audience. He behaves like a real child trying to assemble a map of the world from incomplete pieces. The camera often finds him watching, not speaking. Watching his mother when she isn't looking. Watching the adults around him navigate conversations that shift when he enters the room. Watching the absence that lingers like a ghost nobody mentions. And then, one ordinary day stretched thin by routine, the worlds that have been carefully kept apart begin to collapse into each other. It happens in a place built for transactions, not miracles. A commercial space that hums with the quiet efficiency of corporate success. Polished floors, glass walls, an endless succession of elevators that seem to swallow and spit people out with measured indifference. The production design here deliberately contrasts with the textured clutter of Kyu's home. This is Jiang Nanyan's kingdom, clean, controlled, engineered. The color scheme leans towards cool tones, steel blues, elegant blacks, glassy whites, accented with the occasional touch of greenery that feels more decorative than alive. It is here, in this meticulously constructed vertical world, that the small boy's attention is captured by something that should have only been a prop in someone else's story. As he passes through the lobby, His gaze snags on a promotional photograph hanging near the reception desk, a large, perfectly lit image of the company's CEO. There is Jiang Nanyan, rendered as an icon. Composed, charismatic, the kind of man whose posture suggests a perfect distance from ordinary problems. But the boy doesn't see a mogul or a status symbol. He sees a face that feels like a missing piece in his own reflection. The sequence is staged with astonishing restraint. The camera does not rush. It allows the child's walking pace to dictate the scene's movement. He slows to a stop. We hear the slight rustle of his clothes as he shifts his weight from one foot to the other. The ambient noise of office life continues in the background. Phones ringing softly, heels tapping across the floor, the faint whir of an automatic door. But for him, the world narrows to one image. The music fades to a low, barely there drone, almost like a held breath. His eyes move up and down the photograph, tracing features he has never seen and yet somehow recognizes. The firm line of a mouth, the shape of the jaw, the eyebrows that seem strangely familiar, though he could never explain why. And then, as the scene subtly cuts to a real-time glimpse of Jiang Nanyan walking through an upper-level corridor with his team, his pendant slides out from under his shirt for just an instant, catching the overhead light. The shot flashes by like an echo of the night 6 years ago. The child doesn't see that detail yet. But the film makes sure we do. The necklace has become less an accessory and more a thread weaving stubbornly through their separate timelines. What comes next is a moment that feels inevitable, not because the script arranges it, but because everything we've seen leading up to it has built in us a desperate need for collision. The boy turns, drawn not by logic, but by some instinctive magnetism, and we cut to a separate sequence where Nanyan is stepping out of his car at the building's private entrance. It's a carefully choreographed visual juxtaposition to entrances, to thresholds, one vertical distance spanning their lives. We alternate between the child in the public lobby craning his neck toward the photograph and the man exiting into a quiet, cordoned-off hallway, shielded from the human chaos below. The encounter doesn't happen in a boardroom or a dramatic public event. It happens in a liminal space, in a corridor that is neither entirely private nor fully exposed. Nanyan's entourage moves ahead of him, their chatter dissolving into the background as the sound design dims around his figure. We hear the faint click of his shoes, the soft rustle of his tailored suit. For a moment, the CEO is isolated in the frame, walking in slow, measured strides. There's an almost ritualistic precision to his movements, the accumulated muscle memory of a man who has spent years learning how to take up space without appearing to. And then, from out of the corner of the frame, a small shape appears, running, uncalculated, out of place. The boy has somehow slipped through the human and architectural lattice that separates the world of the powerful from the world of the ordinary. The film does not explain in minute detail how he gets there, because the how is less important than the emotional shock of the fact that he does. He rushes toward Nanyan with a reckless confidence that only children possess, his voice steering through the composed air with an unvarnished certainty that feels almost sacrilegious in this sanitized environment. He calls out one word, the word that has been an empty space in his vocabulary, the word he has been assigning to shadows and half-truths. Dad. The sound lands with the weight of 6 years of avoidance. The dialogue itself is simple, but the staging around it transforms it into something seismic. The corridor's ambient noise seems to vanish. There's a tight close-up on Nanyan's face as he turns, mid-step, not fully processing what he's heard. His brow furrows, but not in anger. It's a microsecond of pure confusion, out of character, unscripted even within his own internal narrative. The boy stops just inches away from him, panting, eyes wide, the kind of openness that adults lose and never get back. He looks up at the CEO with a gaze that is not questioning, not tentative, but absolutely sure. In that gaze, the entire scaffolding of the story shifts. The film understands that this moment only works if it isn't immediately drowned in dialogue. So it doesn't allow anyone to speak right away. Not Nanyan. Not his assistants. not some nearby bystander. Silence becomes the loudest sound. We cut to a side angle. The small figure of the boy facing upward, the tall silhouette of the man looming over him, shadow stretching like a bridge between generations. There's a detail that is easy to miss, but devastating once noticed. The boy's hand, half extended, then curling inward, as if uncertain whether to reach for him or just stand there and let the distance do the talking. And then his eyes catch it. The necklace. The pendant. The same one that swung in the rain, above an unconscious chest, while his mother fought time to keep a stranger alive. Here, in the crisp, sterile light of the corporate hallway, that small piece of metal glints again, and this time, the child is the one who recognizes it. The camera pushes in ever so slightly on his face as something clicks into place. Some subconscious memory, some story he's been told in fragments, some object he has maybe seen once, in a box, in a drawer, in his mother's tightly held past. His lips part in a tiny, soundless exhale of realization. When he repeats the word Dad, there is no question mark. Only a period. From this point on, Sang Wanita Tangguh Datang Membawa Anak begins to operate like a slow, implacable current. The story stops being about the possibility of their paths crossing and becomes about the impossibility of keeping those paths separate anymore. The reunion isn't treated as a triumphant climax. It's treated as an unhealed wound that has finally been forced open. You can feel it in the way Nanyan's carefully constructed composure fractures, not in a grand, performative way, but in a series of minute betrayals that the camera is eager to catch. His pupils contract. His breath pauses. His fingers, which have always been purposeful and controlled, falter as he reaches up instinctively to touch the pendant at his collarbone, as if needing to confirm its presence in order to verify this entire moment is real. When his assistants rush in, shuffling around the boy, apologizing on behalf of someone, scolding some unseen security breach, the scene threatens to devolve into chaos. But the director makes a crucial choice. He keeps cutting back to the child's face, a steady emotional anchor in the swirl of adult anxiety. The boy is not afraid. He is not embarrassed. He is confused by their reaction, but not by his own certainty. And this steadiness in his expression unnerves Nanyan far more than any emotional outburst could. Because in that steadiness lies conviction. A conviction that forces him to look, to see, to acknowledge, even before he has words, even before he has evidence. The cinematography here leans into verticality. Angels emphasize height difference, power disparities, and the moral tilt of the world they inhabit. Shots from above reduce the boy to a dot in a polished floor, isolated amid the grown-up machinery of success. Shots from below place Nanyan in looming authority. But now, that authority is riddled with cracks, because for the first time, someone has stepped into his space who does not see him as a CEO, a savior, or a symbol. Someone who only sees him as a father, or as the possibility of one. When security finally escorts the child away and he calls out again, "Dad, wait." The cry echoes down the corridor with a reverb that the sound mix subtly exaggerates. It's not realistic acoustically, but emotionally, it's exact. The word bounces off the glass, off the steel, off the marble, and sinks into Nanyan's back like a thrown stone. He doesn't turn around. He can't. Yet. The film refuses him that relief. Instead, we watch him walk away from the camera, his shoulders impossibly straight, his stride almost mechanical. But there's something new in the way his shadow moves, slightly unsteady, as if even the light around him is trying to adjust to this new gravitational pull. It is only when he steps into the solitude of his office that the frame finally allows him to exhale. The room is unreasonably large, all clean lines and expensive emptiness. Floor-to-ceiling windows cast a bright cityscape behind him, but the interior feels dimmer than outside, as though his wealth has created a private eclipse. The first thing he does is not sit. He stands by the window, hands braced against the glass, staring at a city that no longer looks like data or territory, but like a maze he's been lost in without realizing. The only sound is the soft hum of the air conditioning, a low mechanical drone that seems, for the first time, inadequate to fill the space. He replays the boy's face in his mind, and the film shows it to us not as a flashback, but as a ghostly overlay, his reflection in the glass intercut with the child's, their features mirroring each other in subtle ways. The tilt of the chin, the angle of the eyes. It is here, in this quiet, that the acting does its most delicate work. The changes in Nanyan's expression are nearly imperceptible, a shift from denial to dawning dread to a kind of hesitant wonder that he tries, unsuccessfully, to suppress. It's not the discovery itself that unnerves him, it's what it implies about the last 6 years of his life, about the decisions made for him, about the ones he made, or failed to make, himself. In contrast, the film cuts to Kyuai-Shu, who has realized, with a cold rush of panic, that her son is no longer by her side. The editing here accelerates. The color temperature changes, cooler, harsher. The handheld camera takes over as she runs through the building, breath ragged, eye scanning every corner. Her fear is not abstract. It is visceral, urgent. When she finally catches sight of him, being gently but firmly directed by a security guard away from the private floor, her entire body seems to fold inward in relief and terror at the same time. The reunion between mother and child here is not tender, it's frantic. She grabs him, drops to her knees, holds his face in her hands as if needing to confirm he's unhurt, unbroken, untouched by whatever world he has wandered into. Her questions tumble out, half scold, half plea. Where did you go? What were you thinking? Do you know how worried I was? The boy's responses are not defensive. He simply points, with the unshakable logic only a child could have, toward the direction where Nanyan had been minutes earlier. Mom, he says, I found Dad. The camera does not push in on her face immediately. It gives her a second, just one, to react without being observed. That second is everything. Her back stiffens. Her fingers tighten around his shoulders. Her breath pauses in her chest like a trapped bird. Then we see her eyes, and in them, a storm we've been waiting to encounter. Fear, yes, but also something more dangerous, recognition. Because for 6 years, Kyuai-Shu has been living in a carefully built wasteland of avoidance. Every choice she's made, every compromise, every sleepless night and exhausted morning has been organized around one guiding principle: protect the child, even if it means erasing the past. But children are terrible at respecting the invisible fences adults construct. They wander. They find things. They name what we won't. The next time Jiang Nanyan and Kyuai-Shu see each other, the film refuses to drench the moment in melodramatic hage. There's no slow-motion walk across a crowded room, no wistful musical cue from the past. Instead, they spot each other from a distance in a place that is neither hers nor his, a semi-public, semi-private meeting area in the building where the ordinary and the exceptional brush shoulders uneasily. He emerges from an elevator with an assistant at his side, scanning through some documents with his usual reserved focus. She stands by a corner column, holding her son's hand so tightly he occasionally flinches, her body language screaming the desire to become invisible. But invisibility is a luxury that fate has long revoked. The first moment their eyes meet, the frame tightens as though the world itself holds its breath. Not with a cliched zoom, but with a gentle narrowing of focus that isolates them from the surrounding motion. The sounds of the office, typing, conversation, the soft ding of elevators, fade slightly, like water receding from the shoreline. Their faces tell two entirely different stories built from the same night. In his eyes, there is the stunned clarity of realization. The trajectory of his thoughts is almost visible. Recognition of her face, recollection of the rain-soaked night, connection to the boy's features, and then the terrible, exhilarating possibility that has been circling his mind since that corridor confrontation. This child is mine. In hers, there is a flicker of something raw and unguarded. Grief, maybe, or a kind of unfinished longing, before the practiced caution rushes in to muffle it. She drops her gaze almost as soon as it rises, her hand tightening again around her son's. But the flash was enough. The film is meticulous about these microscopic beats. It understands that the most important emotional movements often happen in less than a second. Their first conversation after 6 years is not eloquent. It is jagged, halting, full of omissions. They are surrounded by too much glass, too many eyes, too many rules. So the dialogue breaks itself into fragments, like something brittle under pressure. He approaches slowly, each step deliberate, as if trying not to startle a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden motion. She does not step back, but everything in her posture suggests she wants to. When he finally speaks her name, Kyuaikshu, it falls somewhere between a statement and a question. Not just are you really here, but also are you really the one who disappeared with a part of me I didn't know I had? The way he says her name is different from everyone else. There is a weight to it, a memory of it spoken once before in a very different space, under very different circumstances. She responds with a monosyllabic acknowledgement that carefully dodges intimacy. CEO Jiang. Not Nanyan. Not anything that might hint that, at some point in her life, she knew him in any capacity other than this cold, formal hierarchy. The use of that title is a shield, a way of putting every inch of social distance between them back into place. But the shield is cracked before she even raises it, because the child at her side looks between them with a kind of dawning comprehension, as if realizing that the silence between these two adults is not empty, but overfull. The boy, in this scene, becomes the one who refuses to participate in the pretense that adulthood demands. While his mother's body tenses and the CEO's gaze flickers with controlled anxiety, the child is simply looking, studying, searching for confirmation of what his heart declared in that corridor. He notices the way his mother's hand shakes just a bit when it rests on his shoulder. He notices the way the man's voice softens, almost imperceptibly, when he addresses him directly. "What's your name?" Nanyan asks, and the pause before the answer stretches thin as thread. "Jiang." The boy nearly stumbles into the surname he yearns for, then looks at his mother, catches the warning in her eyes, and corrects himself with quiet obedience. The name he carries is hers alone. The film doesn't need melodramatic music to underline the pain here. It leans into the rawness of the performances and the emptiness of the space between them. Prior to this, Nanyan has occupied rooms with absolute ease, imposing his will on deals, negotiations, rooms full of men and women who bend around him like reeds. But in this small, charged triangle, he seems, if not small, then deeply human. Overwhelmed by the quiet, undeniable reality of a child who stands no higher than his waist and yet suddenly towers over every project, every acquisition, every carefully stacked achievement in his life. Visually, the film plays with reflections and glass. We often see them not directly, but reflected in surfaces around them, a ghostly composition where three figures align and fracture across the glossy floors and windows. It's more than stylistic flair. It's a visual metaphor for the story's preoccupation with partial truths and distorted perspectives. Everyone here is seeing some version of the others, but nobody yet knows the full shape of what this reunion will demand of them. As their paths begin to tangle, the screenplay resists the urge to resolve misunderstandings quickly. Instead, it savors the ache of uncertainty. Nanyan spends long nights in his office, not working, but replaying small moments now saturated with new meaning. The way his mother avoided talking about that night years ago whenever he tried, early on, to piece together his lost hours. The faint trace of a different perfume, not the one he recognizes from corporate parties or boardroom encounters, lingering on his shirt when he woke in the hospital. A fleeting glimpse of a face he always thought he might have imagined. And now, a child whose features carry the quiet verdict of truth. The soundscape of his solitude is particularly striking. The city outside is noisy, but the room filters it into an indistinct hush, as if success has put him behind invisible soundproofing. His pen tapping intermittently against the glass table. The hum of a computer screen left idle. a phone buzzing with messages he ignores. Over all of it, a repeated auditory motif, the echo of the boy's voice saying, "Dad." It's not presented as a literal hallucination, but as an emotional resonance seeping into his thoughts like water through a crack. By contrast, Kyuaikshu's nights are filled with a much more tangible noise. The neighbors arguing through thin walls, the distant bark of a stray dog, the rumble of trucks passing by, causing the cheaper glass in her windows to rattle faintly. Her son's soft breathing and occasional murmur in sleep. She moves around the cramped space with a familiarity that borders on muscle memory, clearing dishes, folding clothes, packing school materials, checking bills, her every action underscored by financial precariousness and emotional overprotection. The lighting is dim, warm, often sourced from a single overhead bulb or a bedside lamp, textured by shadows that fall unevenly across her face. There is a sequence, wordless, where she sits at the small table with an old box in front of her. It's been taped, retaped, opened and shut too many times. Her hands hover above it for a long moment, indecisive. Finally, she opens it. Inside, relics from a life that could have been. A hospital wristband, faded receipts, a cheap disposable phone with a dead battery, and tucked in the corner, a photograph, almost out of focus, captured by someone else's careless hand, of her younger self sitting in a hospital waiting area, a figure in a bed visible just beyond the door glass. The faint outline of a man, features indistinct, but for the unmistakable glint of a pendant resting on his chest. The symbolism of the necklace deepens in this quiet montage. It is no longer just a visual marker linking past and present. It has become a vessel of memory, guilt, and withheld truth. The film is telling us that the story of this family is not purely biological. It is deeply material, rooted in objects, spaces, and the traces we leave behind in the rush of crisis. Kyuaikshu takes out an envelope, already frayed on the corners, and removes a small, aged business card with Jiang Nanyan's name printed on it. It's the kind of card handed out routinely, forgotten almost instantly by those used to networking as a reflex. But in her hands, it looks like something far heavier. A key she decided never to use. A door she refused, for reasons we still don't fully know, to open. If the early parts of the film are about shock and revelation, the middle breathes into the quieter, more insidious question. What do you do after you've met the person who proves your life could have been completely different? For Nanyan, this question manifests as an increasing inability to compartmentalize. There are scenes at work where he is completely present in body, but distant in mind. We see him in meetings, surrounded by screens and charts and forecasts, but the camera places him slightly out of focus, as if the lens itself refuses to see him as clearly as everyone else does. Conversations wash over him. People speak numbers, plans, projections, and he responds with habitual efficiency, yet there's a hollowness to the motions. Occasionally, mid-sentence, his eyes will drift toward the window, toward a world he now realizes contains a child who laughs, cries, and dreams without him. The script is clever in how it uses minor characters to expose his internal shift. A perceptive assistant notices small deviations in his behavior, arriving slightly late, lingering too long in his office, staring a bit too long at something on his phone before flipping its screen down when she enters. She is never given excessive lines, but her presence becomes a kind of subtle witness to his unraveling. In her concerned glances and carefully chosen silences, the film shows us how the entire ecosystem around a powerful man adjusts, rebalances, and occasionally trembles when his emotional center of gravity shifts. Meanwhile, the child, now knowing, or believing he knows, who his father is, starts to exist in a liminal emotional space that the film treats with remarkable sensitivity. He doesn't suddenly become obsessed. He doesn't instantly reject his mother. Instead, his world expands in an almost hesitant, confused way. At school, we see him drawing family pictures he isn't quite sure how to frame. Two figures instead of one. A tall shape with indistinct features beside the familiar outline of his mother. The teacher asks polite, casual questions, and he answers with a mixture of pride and secrecy, as if speaking aloud might make this newfound reality both more real and more fragile at once. Kyuai-Shu notices these changes in her son, as all attentive mothers do, and the resulting conflict is not immediately explosive. It's quiet, simmering, a pause before she answers a simple question. A tightening of the jaw when he mentions that uncle at the office. The film is acutely aware that the fiercest battles in families are often fought not in shouting matches, but in silent repressions and carefully redirected conversations. There's a beautifully painful scene where the boy falls asleep on the couch, clutching a rough sketch he made, his interpretation of the man he's decided is his father. It's an almost childlike caricature, broad shoulders, a small necklace drawn with a thick line, a smile that may or may not exist in reality, but which he has imagined into being. Kyuai-Shu finds him like this, the paper half-crumpled under his small hand. She gently pulls it free, stares at it for a long time, and then, with a resignation that looks disturbingly close to surrender, folds it neatly instead of tearing it up. This tiny act, choosing not to erase, becomes one of the film's quiet turning points. It's the moment she acknowledges to herself that the wall she built around their life has already cracked, and no amount of patchwork will make it whole again. For his part, Jiang Nanyan doesn't rush into a claim. Instead, he approaches the situation with the caution of someone who has spent a lifetime dealing in controlled risk, suddenly confronted with a risk that cannot be quantified. There are scenes where he drives at night, aimlessly, but the cinematography doesn't romanticize this as a brooding man-in-car cliché. Instead, the city outside his windshield is shot in soft defocus, lights dissolving into amorphous color swirls. The focus remains inside the car, on his hands clenching the steering wheel, on the reflexive motion of his thumb brushing nervously against the pendant at his chest, as if checking again and again that the past is still attached to him. Eventually, the film brings all three characters into a more sustained orbit, and it does so not through some grand event, but through the mundane spaces of shared necessity. A minor accident at school, a bureaucratic paperwork issue, a situation where a guardian must be present, and timing conspires to make sure that, for once, both their paths intersect in their care for the same child. It's in these neutral territories, school offices, waiting benches, quiet sidewalks, that the most honest encounters occur, free from the scaffolding of corporate hierarchy or domestic walls. In one of these moments, as they wait outside a school office, Nanyan and Kyuai-Shu end up sitting on a narrow bench side by side, their son standing a few feet away, absorbed in a playground game. The composition is exquisite. They are physically close, knees almost touching, but their bodies are turned ever so slightly away from each other. Angels that betray lingering defenses. Between them, on the bench, is a stack of forms that bear the child's name. A literal, rectangular embodiment of what connects them and yet remains unresolved. "What were you planning to do?" he asks quietly, eyes fixed ahead, watching children run in chaotic patterns across the courtyard. "Never tell me?" His tone isn't accusatory. It's too tired to be. There's more bewilderment than anger there, as if he still can't quite believe that an entire human being could exist for 6 years with his DNA and his eyes and his laugh, and he would know nothing of it. Her response cuts deeper not because it's harsh, but because it's painfully honest. "You were never supposed to need to know." The line lingers, humming with layers. Of course he had the right to know. Of course the child had the right to know. But beneath that moral clarity lies the brutal calculus she made, that his world was too high, too far, too dangerous, and hers was too precarious to survive the impact of his entrance. The film doesn't moralize her choice. It holds it up to the light from multiple angles. We see the selfishness in it, yes, a choice to define the child's life according to her fears and her judgments about what is best. But we also see the desperation that shaped that choice, a young woman who once stood outside a hospital room, staring at a man she barely knew but who inhabited a world she had never been invited into, then walking away with the future pressed down in her belly, no map, no guarantee, only the knowledge that if she reached for his world and failed, the cost would fall not only on her, but on the life she carried. In this sense, Sang Wanita Tangguh Datang Membawa Anak is uninterested in simple villains. Its antagonists are not people in the traditional sense, but forces, class, fear, pride, the architecture of power that make some lives seem too far above to touch without burning. Both Jiang Nanyan and Qiu are complicit in the child's 6-year fatherless life, albeit in different ways. He through absence, however unknowing, she through omission, however protective. And the child himself becomes the moral center that quietly indicts them both, not with anger, but with questions. There's a scene where he sits between them on a small park bench, holding an ice cream cone in each hand, one given by his mother, one by Nanyan. The framing is almost symmetrical, two adults on either side, both slightly turned toward him, both trying hard not to look at each other. The boy's expression, though, is pure wonder. For the first time in his memory, the vague idea of a father and the solid reality of his mother coexist in the same frame. He chatters excitedly about school, about a cartoon he likes, about inconsequential things that, to him, feel monumental. The film understands what this moment means to him, even if the adults are too wrapped in their guilt and caution to fully appreciate it. The score slips into a gentle, melancholic melody. Strings, a lone piano key repeated like a heartbeat, underscoring the fragile happiness of this temporary, almost accidental family unity. But this film is too honest to let the image linger without complication. Happiness here never comes unpaid. As the boy finishes the first ice cream, his fingers sticky, he looks up and asks the question that has been building quietly, molecule by molecule, ever since the corridor. Will you come see me again? It's such an ordinary question. Children ask it of relatives, of friends, of people who drift into their orbit and out again. But in this context, it becomes a verdict. Nanyan hesitates, and that hesitation is a rupture. You can see the ragging conflict behind his eyes. Part of him wants to say yes immediately, to promise things he doesn't yet know how to deliver. Another part, the part trained by years of guardedness and ruthlessness, recoils from commitments that cannot be managed like contracts. Before he can answer, Qiu steps in, voice soft but firm, "We'll see." It's an answer that is no answer at all. The boy's smile dims just a bit at the edges, like a light flickering as the power source falters. He nods, because he has been raised to accept his mother's word as final. But as the camera lingers on his face, we see the first shadow of doubt about her infallibility cross his features. It is, in many ways, the day he learns that the adults in his life are no longer monolithic, no longer aligned, no longer able to control the narrative he so desperately wants to believe. From this point, the tension in the film becomes less about revelation and more about choice. Now that they all know, what will they do? Will Nanyan fight to claim his son, to carve space for him in a life that was never designed to accommodate the chaos of fatherhood? Will Qiu let go, to open the tightly locked door of their world to a man who, whether she likes it or not, will permanently alter its gravity? And perhaps the most quietly excruciating question, what happens to a child who begins to sense that he is no longer just loved, but contested? These questions begin to infiltrate every frame. In boardrooms, Nanyan's expressions harden and soften in strange, unsettling patterns as stakeholders bring up family image, legacy, eventual heirs. In the narrow kitchen of her apartment, Qiu pauses, dish in hand, when her son mentions something Nanyan said, something small but laden with implication, like how big his house must be, or how his car smells like fresh leather, or how his hands feel both unfamiliar and somehow right when they hold his. Cinematography continues to enforce the emotional stakes through spatial dynamics. When Nanyan visits their neighborhood for the first time, driving slowly through cramped streets that force his expensive car to inch forward like a cautious intruder, the camera adopts a slightly elevated angle, watching the vehicle as though it were a foreign object in a body that might reject it. The children playing on the sidewalks pause to stare. Laundry hangs from balconies above like flags of an entirely different country. The car's glossy exterior reflects back fragments of chipped walls and weathered doors, warping them around its smooth curves. It is not a graceful fit. It is an intrusion, a visual metaphor for what his presence represents in their modest, hard-earned stability. Inside the apartment, he seems larger than the space allows. Not just physically, but atmospherically. The room seems to contract around him. Objects that previously blended into the background now stand out in stark relief because they are being seen through his eyes. A broken fan repaired with taped wire. A school bag with a frayed strap. Two mismatched chairs squeezed under a table too small for 3 plates to fit comfortably. Yet there is also evidence of abundance here, an abundance of care. Drawings stacked to the wall. A small shelf of storybooks worn from repeated reading. A blanket folded neatly on the couch where the boy sometimes falls asleep waiting for his mother to finish her evening work. His fingers brush against one of the drawings, a family portrait where the father figure is drawing taller than the house itself. For a moment, his stern business world face softens almost before he can stop it. The camera captures the fleeting vulnerability, the nearly imperceptible quiver at the corner of his mouth as his thumb traces the roughly drawn necklace around the stick figure father's neck. When he turns to find Qiu watching him from the doorway, the air thickens with all the unspoken things between them, regrets, accusations, possibilities. Here, the dialogue becomes a razor. "Is this what you were protecting him from?" he asks, gesturing vaguely around the room, not with disdain, but with a kind of pained incredulity. To him, the hardships are obvious. The crampedness, the fragility of every possession, the visible strain in every corner. To her, they are only half the story. "He's loved," she answers, the word landing with a strange combination of defiance and apology. "He's safe. He's mine." The last word is almost swallowed, barely audible, but emotionally deafening. The film knows that love, in these situations, becomes territorial. That the desire to do what's best for a child can warp into a desire to own his narrative, to control his loyalties, to define his history. It doesn't flinch from showing the ugliness in that. Nor does it sanitize the way Nanyan's sudden paternal drive is entangled with wounded pride and belated responsibility. Neither of them is purely noble. Neither of them is purely selfish. They are, like most real people, trying to navigate a moral landscape they were never prepared for, guided only by instinct, fear, and whatever scraps of courage they can muster. As conflicts escalate, the film's sound design evolves with them. Arguments between the adults are not scored with melodramatic strings. Often, they unfold against a background of mundane noises that refuse to quiet down for drama. A neighbor's TV blaring through paper-thin walls. A street vendor shouting an evening discount. The scrape of a broom against concrete. Life goes on around them, indifferent to their crisis, reinforcing the isolating truth that even the most world-shattering revelations in a family can be completely invisible to the world outside. Yet in the stillness after these fights, in the moments when one of them sits alone, she on the edge of her bed, he in the darkened hush of his home's expansive, tastefully lit emptiness, the score re-emerges. Minimalist, aching, often built around a simple piano motif that recurs whenever one of them is forced to confront not what the other has done, but what they themselves have become. It's in these segments that the film becomes almost unbearably introspective, forcing us as viewers to linger in uncomfortable empathy. To ask ourselves not, who is right? But, what would I have done with their fears, in their world? As the narrative moves, slowly, inexorably, toward the question of custody, of rights, of public recognition, the child's behavior begins to change in subtler, more heart-breaking ways. He starts to perform. Around Nanyan, he tries to be impressive, showing good grades, telling stories of how he helps his mother, demonstrating that he is worthy of the man's time. Around Qiu, he sometimes withholds, a small detail here, a moment there, testing the limits of her patience, her security in his love. These are not manipulations born of malice, they are coping mechanisms born of a newfound fear that love has become something that can be earned or lost. One evening, caught between their growing tension, he asks a question no child should ever have to consider. If I had never found him, would you be happier? The line is delivered without accusation, just quiet curiosity. But the weight of it is Olympian. For a split second, both adults are rendered speechless, not by the complexity of the question, but by the horrific reality that, privately, in their darkest thoughts, each has considered some version of it. The guilt that follows is almost a character in its own right, pressing down on their shoulders like an invisible hand. It's in the wake of questions like this, and the choices they begin to trigger, that the film tightens its grip. But here, as their world teeters on the edge of decisions that cannot be undone, as the silence between them thickens into something that feels nearly physical, pressing at their chests, we are left with an image that freezes the story in a single, fragile breath. The boy, standing alone at the threshold of Nanyan's home, his father's world stretched out behind him in a vast, immaculate expanse of glass and marble. His mother's world somewhere far beyond the gated driveway, hidden by distance and darkness. He holds one small suitcase in his hand. His fingers clamp tightly around the handle, knuckles white. His eyes flicker back and forth between the door behind him, now silently closing, and the night outside, where a figure stands too far away to be clearly seen, just a silhouette framed by the last dying light of dusk. He doesn't move forward. He doesn't step back. He just stands there, caught between two worlds that both claim to love him, both terrified to lose him, and neither fully willing to admit what it will cost him to belong to either. And the door's soft mechanical latch, as it clicks shut behind his small frame, sounds less like security and more like a verdict still waiting to be spoken. The glint of that necklace doesn't fade when the light shifts. It feels like it stays imprinted on the inside of the eye, the way a camera flash leaves behind a phantom shape you keep blinking at. The series leans into that lingering effect, and the next stretch unfolds like the aftermath of a sound you can't unhear. In the morning, the world resumes its routines with a cruel indifference of normalcy, but the framing tells you something has changed. The kitchen is shot a fraction tighter, corners closer, doorways narrower, as if the house itself has begun to press inward. Jiang Nanyan moves through her morning like someone walking a tightrope, every step measured, every gesture curated for the audience of a child who must not sense fear. The boy chatters, untroubled by the adult storm he accidentally summoned, and Qiu stands at the edge of domestic space like a man unsure whether to remove his shoes or his heart. What makes Sang Wanita Tangguh Datang Membawa Anak so effective is how it makes you feel the violence of politeness. There's a conversation at the breakfast table when nothing is said directly, yet every line is sharp enough to cut. Jiang Nanyan asks a question with the calm tone of an employer conducting an interview. Qiu answers with the careful honesty of someone who has been punished for saying too much. And the child, because children are the universe's most merciless editors, interrupts with simple statements that turn subtext into threat. He'll mention a story he heard. He'll repeat a word he doesn't understand. He'll ask why mom looked sad last night. Each innocent line lands like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading across faces trying desperately to remain smooth. The show's sound design becomes almost predatory here. You start noticing the small noises that grow louder when people stop speaking. A spoon taps ceramic. A chair leg scrapes the floor. The faint click of a phone screen locking. These are not background sounds, they're emotional tells. They fill in the spaces where truth wants to arrive but is denied entry. And the series repeatedly uses the hum of appliances, the refrigerator, the air purifier, the low whir of a coffee machine, as if domestic life has its own artificial heartbeat, trying to mimic comfort while anxiety presses beneath it. Qiu doesn't ask the obvious question yet, and that restraint is not avoidance. It's instinct. He watches the boy's face, noticing the familiar shape of a smile, the angle of a brow, the unconscious habits that are inherited more often than taught. The direction gives us close-ups that never feel intrusive but always feel intimate. The boy's fingers gripping a cup, his eyes glancing toward Jiang Nanyan for approval, the way he leans toward Qiu with a trust that suggests stories have already been told about him in a world Qiu never entered. You can see Qiu's mind trying to reconcile this, his gaze drifting, as if he's searching for a version of the past where this was possible, and he simply missed it. And Jiang Nanyan sees him seeing. That's the quiet tragedy. She's not just defending a secret, she's witnessing the moment someone begins to recognize the outline of a stolen life. Her composure holds, but the show lets the composure become its own kind of horror. It's easy to cry on screen. It's harder to not cry while the camera is close enough to read your pulse. Her eyes remain dry, but her jaw sets in a way that suggests she is physically holding back a flood. She's not afraid of Qiu's anger as much as she's afraid of what his certainty would do to her carefully balanced world. Certainty collapses possibilities. As long as the truth is unspoken, it can still be negotiated. Spoken truth is a door that closes behind you. The series begins to expand outward from the home, and this is where its visual poetry becomes sharper. In the corporate world, Jiang Nanyan's office is all vertical lines and empty air. The ceilings feel too high. The windows show a city that looks distant, like it's been placed there for decoration rather than lived in. When she sits at her desk, the camera often places her off-center, swallowed by space, which is a brilliant inversion of her power. She is a CEO, yes, but the show frames that power as isolating rather than triumphant. She's at the top of a building and still trapped. Qiu's world, when we begin to see it more clearly, is grounded and imperfect. The places he moves through have scuffed surfaces, crowded corners, human noise. His phone screen is cracked. His clothing has that specific lived-in looseness that suggests practicality over presentation. The series doesn't romanticize poverty or struggle, but it does contrast textures. Jiang Nanyan's life is designed to appear seamless, Qiu's life is stitched together. And when these two textures meet, the friction is emotional as much as social. Their reunion isn't just about love and secrets, it's about class, control, and the ways people learn to defend themselves depending on what the world has given or taken. There's a scene in an elevator that feels like a miniature thesis statement. Jiang Nanyan enters, alone, her expression neutral, her posture flawless. The elevator doors begin to close, and at the last second, a hand stops them. Qiu steps in. No dramatic music. No slow motion. Just that quiet mechanical delay, the doors reopening like a reluctant second chance. They stand beside each other with a respectful distance that feels like a lie. The camera frames them in the mirrored walls, their reflections multiplying. To people turned into 4, into 6, into endless versions that never touch. This is what the show is saying. You can repeat an image, but you cannot repeat time. You can stand close, but closeness is not intimacy. The elevator moves upward, but neither of them feels like they're going anywhere. They exchange a few words, professional, guarded, and the brilliance is in what happens to their breathing. In confined spaces, you hear breath. The show leans into that. You can hear Jiang Nanyan inhale through her nose a little sharper than usual. You can hear Qiu exhale slowly, as if trying to empty himself of reaction. The elevator's soft motor becomes a low drone, like a tinnitus of tension. When the doors open, the air changes, and you realize you were holding your own breath along with them. This series is obsessed with thresholds. Doors, elevators, hallways, lobbies, gates, car windows. It keeps placing characters on one side of something, watching what's on the other. A threshold is not just a physical line, it's a moral one. Cross it and your life changes. Refuse it and your life stagnates. Jiang Nanyan is a woman who has lived by controlling thresholds, who gets access to her, what truths enter her home, what parts of herself remain private. Qiu is a man who keeps being pushed across them. Fate keeps opening doors he didn't ask for, And now he's standing in front of the biggest one, the possibility that he is a father. The child becomes the series' most potent symbol of inevitability. In one scene, he draws with crayons at a small table while adults talk behind him. The camera focuses on his drawing more than on their faces, and what he draws is simple. 3 figures holding hands, one taller, one in the middle, one smaller. It's the universal child's image of family, uncomplicated and absolute. The adults, meanwhile, speak in fragments, negotiating logistics and boundaries, but the child has already written the emotional truth in wax and color. That drawing is not cute. It is devastating. It is an accusation made with innocence. It says, "This is what I believe. Make it real." And the series, instead of turning this into an immediate sentimental payoff, makes it painful. Because for Jiang Nanyan, that drawing is not hope. It is threat. A child's belief is powerful, and it will demand reality from her. She looks at the paper, and the camera catches a flicker of something like grief, because she knows what it costs to make that image true. She knows what she would have to surrender: control, narrative, perhaps even safety. We don't yet fully understand what happened 6 years ago beyond the rescue, but the show plants hints like shards of glass. A name mentioned and then cut off. A phone call she declines and then deletes. A moment where she flinches at the sound of a certain ringtone, as if it belongs to a period of her life she has sealed away. Kwai-Chu begins to investigate, not in a detective sense, but in the way a wounded person seeks coherence. He notices patterns. The necklace, obviously. The child's age. The timing. The way Jiang Nanyan's friends or colleagues avoid mentioning personal life around her, like they've been trained to respect a boundary that is also a wound. He watches the boy interact with her. The way the child's affection is met with quick tenderness followed by abrupt retreat, as if Jiang Nanyan is afraid of indulging in warmth because warmth creates expectations. And in all this observation, Kwai-Chu's own psychology becomes clearer. He is a man who doesn't trust good fortune. Even the possibility of having a son enters his mind like a suspicious gift. He doesn't immediately reach for entitlement. He reaches for fear. What if he's wrong? What if he's right? What if he wants this too much and gets punished for it? The show's score starts threading in motifs now, and it's subtle enough that you might not consciously notice, but your body does. A set of notes associated with the necklace returns whenever it catches light. Another, softer motif appears around the child. High, fragile, like glass wind chimes. And when Jiang Nanyan and Kwai-Chu share space, the music often drains away entirely, leaving them with nothing but ambient sound, forcing you to feel the rawness of their tension without emotional guidance. It's a bold choice. It trusts the actors' faces to carry the weight. And they do. There's a particularly striking scene in a parking garage, which the series uses like an emotional underworld. The lighting is harsh and uneven. Fluorescent strips flicker, leaving pockets of shadow. The concrete swallows sound, turning footsteps into echoes that feel like ghosts following you. Jiang Nanyan walks alone, heels clicking, her silhouette sharp against the grey. Kwai-Chu appears from behind a pillar, not in an aggressive way, but with the suddenness of someone who has been waiting too long. The camera holds them in a wide shot at first, emphasizing distance and emptiness, to figures in a cavern of cement. Then it slowly pushes in, narrowing the world until only their faces matter. In this scene, Kwai-Chu finally approaches the edge of asking. The dialogue circles the question like a knife circling skin. He mentions the necklace. He asks where she got it. Jiang Nanyan answers with a tone that is technically calm but emotionally loaded, the way someone speaks when they are trying to keep their life from collapsing in public. And then she does something that reveals the depth of her fear. She changes the subject to work. She weaponizes professionalism as a shield. It's not just avoidance, it's survival. To her, the personal is not safe. The personal is where people die inside. Kwai-Chu doesn't let it go entirely, but he also doesn't force it. Instead, he says something quieter, something that lands deeper. He says the boy called him father. not as an accusation, as a fact that can't be unfacty. The words hang in the parking garage air, and you feel the concrete around them like a pressure chamber. Jiang Nanyan's reaction is almost imperceptible, a tiny widening of the eyes, a slight tightening around the mouth. But the series gives that micro-expression the gravity of an earthquake. For a second, her CEO mask slips, and you glimpse the woman beneath. Not cold, not cruel, but terrified of what love has the power to ruin. She doesn't deny it outright. That's the brilliance. If she denied, the show would become a straightforward live-assist truth melodrama. Instead, she chooses ambiguity. She says something like, "Children say many things. Children mimic. Children imagine." And the camera, in response, cuts to Qiuaiqiu's face, where you see the pain of being treated like an imaginary thing, being reduced to a story a child made up. His eyes harden, not into anger, but into resolve. Because now the series has shifted. It's no longer will he find out? It becomes how will they survive the truth? As the narrative continues, the show begins layering in the world around them. People who knew the past, people who benefit from the silence, people who fear what the reunion might expose. But it never turns into a conspiracy thriller. The external tensions exist to amplify internal ones. A colleague might hint at Jiang Nanyan's history with a subtle comment at a business dinner. A family elder might appear, watching the child with too much interest. A rival might threaten Jiang Nanyan's reputation. And suddenly the question of the boy's father isn't just emotional, it's political, corporate, reputational. The series cleverly links personal secrets to public consequences, reminding us that in certain worlds, love isn't private. It's leverage. There's a dinner scene that exemplifies this. The setting is elegant, almost sterile. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, light reflected in small controlled sparkles. Jiang Nanyan sits among executives, laughing at the correct moments, performing ease. The child is with her, an unusual choice, one that already signals a crack in her boundaries. And Qiuaiqiu is invited, not as a partner, but as what, exactly? The show makes that ambiguity painful. He sits slightly apart, dressed neatly, but not in the uniform of this world. The camera often isolates him in the frame, surrounded by blurred luxury, as if he's a stain on a perfect image. The conversation at the table is smooth, but underneath it there's an interrogation disguised as small talk. People ask about the child's father with the casual cruelty of the privileged, those who assume they have the right to know. Jiang Nanyan answers with practiced vagueness. The child, again, becomes the honest weapon. He looks at Qiuaiqiu and smiles. He calls him Ayah again, louder this time, with the pride of a child who thinks he's introducing someone important. And something in the room shifts. It's not just shock. It's calculation. You can see eyes flicker between Jiang Nanyan and Qiuaiqiu. You can feel reputations reshuffling in real time. The soundtrack goes quieter, almost as if the room's collective breath has been sucked out. Jiang Nanyan's smile freezes, not because she's embarrassed, but because she's cornered. Qiuaiqiu's posture stiffens, and for a moment you see the temptation to stand up, to claim the name, to say yes, I am, because the child's belief is a kind of love, and love is intoxicating when you've been deprived of it.